The chandelier lights gave the restaurant a warm, golden sheen, the kind that made even the polished silverware appear to glow. Soft piano music floated through the air, blending with the quiet clinks of wine glasses and the low hum of conversations. Everything about the place, its marble floors, framed artwork, and velvet-backed chairs, whispered money, elegance, and strict formality. At the far end of the dining room, a waitress in her early 60s moved carefully between tables, her white shirt pressed, her red apron tied neatly around her waist. Her hair, streaked with soft gray, was pulled back in a tight ponytail that kept slipping loose during long shifts. She always pushed it back with the same graceful motion, the kind that made diners assume she was calm even when exhaustion tugged at her bones. Her name was Margaret, and this double shift wasn't unusual. Rent didn't wait. Medical bills certainly didn't. She had learned long ago that survival was a quiet, disciplined routine. Wake early, take the Q train into Manhattan, work until her feet throbbed, head home to a tiny studio with a stove that clicked twice before lighting. She never complained. People didn't come to fine dining restaurants to hear about a waitress's struggles. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's video, I want to thank you for choosing to watch my channel when there are so many other creators out there. Once again, I sincerely thank you, and I hope you can support me with a subscription and leave a comment with the number 1 after you finish listening to this story. Thank you very much. Tonight, she hoped for a smooth service, steady tables, polite diners, nothing unpredictable. But the room began to stir. A man in traditional Middle Eastern attire entered, followed by a pair of assistants who peeled off to take another table. His presence shifted the energy in a way Margaret recognized instantly. Wealth didn't just walk, it commanded. Even from across the dining room, she could see how other guests straightened slightly in their seats, curious about the arrival of someone important. Whispers floated around the staff station. That's the billionaire traveler people talked about. Now, he's known for testing servers. Be careful. He's intense. Margaret kept her eyes down and continued wiping a wine glass until it gleamed. She had no interest in serving him. Regulars were easier, kinder, predictable. She preferred the quiet ones, the couples celebrating anniversaries, the solo diners reading books between courses. But fate in restaurants cared little for preference. A loud crash behind her snapped every head around. A young server had slipped on a wet spot while carrying an entire tray of glasses. The manager rushed over, then turned sharply toward Margaret. "Margaret," he said, voice tight with panic, "I need you to take table 12. Her heart dipped. Table 12 meant him. Still, she nodded. Service first. Dignity always. That was the unspoken rule she'd lived by for 20 years. She approached the table with practiced calm. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his smile wide and almost theatrical. A glass of wine sat untouched in front of him, positioned like a prop rather than a beverage. He seemed to be in a particularly loud mood, laughing, making sweeping gestures with his hands, speaking with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. "Good evening, sir," Margaret said gently. "How may I assist you?" He didn't look at her at first, only chuckled to himself before glancing up as if her presence amused him. Then the requests began. Short, clipped, demanding. No eye contact. No courtesy. He tapped the table impatiently when she wrote down his order. He corrected her pronunciation of the dish, despite the fact that she'd said it perfectly. He waved his hand dismissively when she set down his wine glass, as though she were interrupting him simply by doing her job. Margaret inhaled quietly, centering herself. She had endured far worse in her life. A rude customer wasn't going to break her. But the escalation was subtle and precise, like a slow fuse burning toward something sharp. The tone of his voice grew louder, his gestures more exaggerated, and the smirk on his face told her he was enjoying this imbalance of power. Finally, he leaned forward, pointing a finger at her in a way that made the diners at the surrounding tables pause mid-bite. He said something quickly in Arabic, something that carried a tone she recognized even without knowing the words, a joke made at her expense. But Margaret did know the words. The shock wasn't that he mocked her. It was that he assumed she wouldn't understand. She straightened her spine, eyes steady, and opened her mouth, and that is where the moment that would change everything truly began. Margaret felt the restaurant's warm lights blur slightly as the billionaire's words settled in, carrying a sharpness that cut through the polished calm of the dining room and revealed a cruelty he clearly believed was private. The man continued laughing loudly, convinced she was nothing more than a background fixture, someone too old or too simple to grasp the meaning behind his mockery, his assumptions layered with an entitlement so casual it could have passed for habit. She steadied her breathing, allowing the insult to hang in the air for a brief moment, not out of hesitation, but to decide whether this was the evening she would finally stop shrinking herself to make room for someone else's ego. When she lifted her gaze, her eyes held a clarity sharpened not by anger, but by a lifetime's worth of quiet endurance. And for the first time that night, the billionaire's confident grin halted just slightly, as if he sensed an unexpected shift in the balance he thought he controlled. Margaret spoke in fluent, precise Arabic, her tone calm and measured, choosing each word with the careful dignity she had always carried like armor, and the man's expression snapped from amusement to stunned disbelief as he realized she understood everything he had said. The diners seated nearby fell silent almost instantly, their forks suspended and their conversations dissolving into a collective pause that spread across the room like a held breath. Margaret continued speaking, switching gently back to English with a firmness that felt both soft and unbreakable, telling him that wealth could buy food, wine, prestige, and even the illusion of importance, but it could never purchase the respect he had discarded so casually. The billionaire's jaw clenched, his pride stung by the revelation that the woman he underestimated not only understood his native language but matched his verbal sharpness with a grace he could never imitate. He attempted to respond, but the sudden weight of watching eyes pressed against him, and for a moment he seemed smaller, as though stripped of the stage he thought he commanded effortlessly. The room still held its silence, but now the quiet carried a different texture, one woven from shock, admiration, and a quiet reckoning that drifted from table to table. A single patron near the bar clapped once, the sound crisp and surprising against the velvet stillness, and then another followed, and another, until the applause expanded across the dining room, in a rising wave that left the billionaire crimson-faced and rigid. Margaret didn't bask in the attention. She simply stepped back with the same composed posture she had maintained for decades, her heartbeat steady despite the intensity of what had just unfolded. The billionaire scoffed under his breath and reached for his glass, attempting to mask his embarrassment with a display of indignation, yet his hands trembled slightly, betraying a loss of control he couldn't conceal. Before he could gather himself enough to reclaim the situation, Margaret quietly excused herself and moved toward the service station, her steps measured, her mind replaying the scene with a swirl of conflicting emotions, relief for finally speaking up, fear for the consequences that might follow, and a cautious pride she rarely allowed herself to feel. Inside the staff corridor, the manager rushed toward her with worry etched across his face, speaking in a hushed voice that tried to remain calm but carried a nervous tremor as he explained the possible risks of confronting a high-profile guest. Margaret listened, nodding politely, though a knot of uncertainty settled deep in her chest as she remembered the envelope of unpaid bills waiting on her kitchen counter and the rising cost of her medications that insurance barely covered. She assured him she was all right, though inside she wondered whether one moment of dignity would cost her the job she depended on so heavily. Her coworkers, however, gathered around quietly, offering supportive glances and soft words of reassurance that she had done nothing wrong and that the entire dining room had witnessed the man's behavior long before she responded. Their solidarity warmed her more than she expected, reminding her that kindness still existed behind the polished machinery of hospitality work, even when power tried to overshadow it. Still, Margaret felt the uncertainty gnaw at her, knowing that reputations, especially those backed by vast wealth, had a way of rewriting events according to their own convenience. She stepped back toward the dining room, keeping her posture steady despite the unease twisting through her stomach, and watched as the billionaire signaled for his check with abrupt, irritated gestures that tried to reassert authority. His eyes avoided hers entirely now, shifting toward the window, the ceiling, anywhere but the woman who had dismantled his arrogance with a single sentence spoken in the language he believed belonged exclusively to him. Margaret felt no triumph in his discomfort, only a quiet acceptance that dignity often demanded bravery, even when bravery came with a price. As she returned to the service counter, the murmurs of guests still filled the room, carrying a mixture of admiration and disbelief, and she sensed that the moment had already grown larger than the two of them. She could feel the tension of what might come next, pressing gently but insistently against her thoughts, whether she would be reprimanded, whether the billionaire would retaliate, or whether the truth of what happened would ripple beyond these walls in ways she could not yet imagine. Still, Margaret straightened her shoulders, reminding herself that integrity rarely followed the path of least resistance, and whatever tomorrow held, she had spoken from a place of honesty that no one could take away. The applause that had filled the dining room gradually faded into a low wave of murmurs, yet the energy it left behind clung to the air with a quiet insistence that Margaret felt even as she retreated once more behind the service station. She could sense dozens of eyes lingering on her, not with judgment or discomfort, but with a kind of respectful curiosity, as though the guests recognized they had witnessed something rare and unexpectedly human in a place built on polished manners and restrained interactions. She continued arranging silverware with steady hands, though her heart pressed hard against her ribs with an anxious rhythm she couldn't quite settle. The manager hovered nearby, exchanging whispered conversations with the maitre d', both of them glancing periodically toward table 12, where the billionaire signed his check with stiff, irritated motions, his composure visibly chipped. Margaret didn't need to hear the details to know they were debating whether the incident might attract complaints, legal threats, or reputational fallout that upscale establishments feared more than nearly anything else. She swallowed quietly, feeling the weight of those possibilities coil around her, reminding her how vulnerable workers like her remained, no matter how respectfully they carried themselves or how carefully they avoided conflict. As the billionaire finally rose from his seat, Margaret observed him from a distance, noting how his earlier swagger had diminished into a tense, clipped stride as he exited the dining room without acknowledging any staff member. The room's attention followed him until the door closed behind him with a soft thud, and only then did the atmosphere settle back into its normal rhythm, though a scattered sense of anticipation lingered like the hum of static after a storm. She could feel that something had shifted irrevocably, even if she couldn't yet see the edges of the change. It wasn't until she slipped into the break room to refill the water jug that one of the younger servers rushed in holding a phone with eyes wide in astonishment, explaining breathlessly that a diner had posted the entire exchange online. Margaret felt her stomach tighten with apprehension, but the server reassured her that the clip was already receiving comments, praising her dignity, her language skills, and her refusal to tolerate mistreatment. The idea that strangers across the internet were watching something so private and emotionally charged left Margaret simultaneously unsettled and oddly relieved, knowing the truth of the moment was visible rather than buried under whatever tale the billionaire might choose to tell. Within an hour, the video had spread across multiple platforms, gathering thousands of views and rapidly climbing as more users shared it with captions celebrating her courage and condemning entitled behavior toward service workers. People began dissecting every detail of the interaction, from the precise shade of shock on the billionaire's face to the way Margaret had stood tall without raising her voice or losing her composure. Comments poured in describing similar experiences. Stories from restaurant workers, hotel employees, and flight attendants who felt recognized by her calm resistance, transforming her into an unexpected symbol of resilience. Back in the dining room, customers approached her quietly, offering words of support that softened the lingering tension in her chest much more gently than she expected. One older woman clasped Margaret's hands and whispered that dignity was a rare currency in the world and that she had shown an extraordinary amount of it in the face of cruelty. Another guest insisted on leaving a generous tip, not out of pity but gratitude, for the reminder that respect should never bend before wealth, no matter how imposing it appeared. As the dinner service drew closer to finishing, the manager finally asked Margaret to step into his office, where he closed the door behind them with a sigh that carried both caution and understanding. He explained that the situation had gained attention faster than the restaurant could respond, and although he feared potential backlash, he also recognized the overwhelming public support she had already received. He reassured her that she wouldn't be disciplined and that the restaurant would stand behind her if the billionaire attempted to retaliate, offering a rare moment of solidarity that Margaret hadn't dared to expect. When she emerged from the office, her coworkers greeted her with quiet smiles and encouraging pats on the shoulder, creating a small circle of warmth that pushed back the anxieties swirling through her mind. Though uncertainty remained, Margaret felt a shift within herself, a sense of grounded confidence that came from knowing that speaking truthfully, even under pressure, had not isolated her but connected her to an entire community that understood her struggle. By the time she stepped outside to head home, The city lights glimmered across the pavement, and her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers who had tracked down her social media profile to commend her composure. She walked slowly toward the subway entrance, the autumn air crisp against her cheeks, carrying the mixture of exhaustion and cautious hope that often follows an unexpected turning point. She didn't know what the next day would bring, whether the sudden attention would fade quietly or grow into something larger, but she felt steadier than she had in years, held upright by the simple truth that dignity, once spoken aloud, echoed longer than cruelty ever could. The next morning, sunlight filtered gently through the thin curtains of Margaret's small apartment, casting pale golden stripes across the worn hardwood floor as she brewed her usual cup of coffee, trying to steady herself against the swirl of uncertainty the night had left behind. She sat at her tiny kitchen table, the edges chipped from years of use, and scrolled hesitantly through her phone, expecting the viral storm to have faded, but instead finding that the video had multiplied in reach, gathering hundreds of thousands of views and an outpouring of supportive messages from strangers across the country. Every comment she read felt both overwhelming and quietly comforting, reminding her that her moment of truth had resonated far beyond the walls of the restaurant. While she was processing the barrage of notifications, an email arrived from the restaurant's owner, requesting that she come in earlier than usual for a private conversation. The message was polite yet firm, carrying an undertone of significance that made her heart tighten with a blend of apprehension and fragile hope. She dressed carefully, smoothing the wrinkles from her shirt, and choosing the same pair of sturdy shoes she had worn the previous night, hoping they would help her stay grounded if the meeting took an unexpected turn. Upon entering the restaurant, she found the owner waiting near the front, a composed man in his late 50s whose calm presence always suggested a deeper intelligence beneath his reserved demeanor. He greeted her warmly and invited her to sit in one of the booths near the window, where the early morning light softened the otherwise formal atmosphere, with a sincerity she didn't anticipate. He began explaining that he had watched the recording several times and felt both proud and deeply moved by the way she had handled an impossible situation with poise that reflected the very values he wished the establishment embodied. He spoke candidly about his own concerns regarding the imbalance of power that service workers often faced, admitting that he had been searching for ways to address the issue without turning the restaurant into a battleground for social debates. Margaret listened intently, surprised by how much his words resonated with her own lifelong belief that respect should never be conditional on status, wealth, or influence. The owner paused for a moment, clasping his hands thoughtfully, before revealing that several hospitality associations had reached out overnight, wanting to highlight Margaret's moment as part of a broader conversation about dignity in the service industry. Then, with a calm but serious tone, he told her that the restaurant wanted to officially support her, not merely through a public statement, but by offering her a new position as a senior host and training mentor, a role that would allow her to guide new employees and set a standard for respectful, dignified service culture. Margaret felt her breath catch, realizing she was being offered something she had never allowed herself to imagine, a chance to step out of the relentless cycle of double shifts and physical exhaustion, and into a role shaped by wisdom rather than wear. She felt tears prick behind her eyes, but she steadied herself, listening closely as he explained the details with a kindness that felt both unexpected and deeply welcome. Before she could respond, the owner added that an influential figure in the city, a philanthropist, known for supporting workers' rights, had also reached out, requesting to meet with her and explore the possibility of collaborating on a new program focused on promoting respect and fair treatment within luxury service environments. The idea felt surreal, almost dreamlike, yet the sincerity in the owner's voice grounded it in a reality she couldn't ignore. She realized that what had begun as a moment of humiliation had transformed into a catalyst for meaningful change, both in her life and potentially far beyond it. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled slightly as she expressed gratitude for the trust and responsibility being offered, explaining that she had never sought attention but simply refused to remain silent when her dignity was challenged. The owner nodded with quiet understanding, telling her that courage rarely announced itself loudly, but lived in the small, steady acts of people who chose integrity even when it cost them comfort. His words eased a tension she had carried for years, a tension born from decades of believing her voice mattered less because of the uniform she wore. After the meeting, she walked slowly through the dining room, noticing how different the space felt in the soft morning light, almost as though it recognized the shift in her place within its rhythm. Some of her coworkers had arrived early and greeted her with warm smiles, their admiration no longer tinged with worry but with a pride that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. The applause from the previous night echoed faintly in her memory, not as noise but as reassurance that her actions had touched people more deeply than she understood. As she stepped outside onto the sidewalk, the city felt unusually bright, and the autumn breeze carried a crispness that made her breath feel lighter than it had in months. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from the philanthropic organization requesting a specific date for their meeting, and Margaret allowed herself a small, grateful smile as she realized that her life was shifting toward a new chapter she had never expected, but now felt ready to embrace. The days following her promotion unfolded with a surreal intensity that Margaret struggled to fully comprehend, as the video continued spreading far beyond the expected rhythm of fleeting online attention, and instead grew into a national conversation that reached television networks, advocacy groups, and prominent voices across multiple industries. Journalists began requesting interviews to discuss the moment she confronted the billionaire with such quiet authority, and many commentators praised her composure as a rare example of integrity displayed under extraordinary pressure, especially in an environment where workers were often expected to endure mistreatment silently. She declined most invitations, choosing instead to stay focused on her new responsibilities. Yet the public interest grew even stronger with every passing hour. Margaret arrived at work each morning with the same modest energy she had carried for decades, though now her steps felt steadier, as though the ground beneath her had finally chosen to support rather than challenge her. Guests who recognized her from the viral clip often approached with gratitude, telling her how her dignity had inspired them to speak up for themselves or treat service workers with greater respect. She listened with humility, occasionally overwhelmed by the idea that a single moment of honesty could ripple into so many lives, reshaping perspectives she had never imagined influencing. Meanwhile, the billionaire found himself at the center of mounting backlash that escalated rapidly as more people scrutinized his behavior, uncovering past complaints from workers in several countries who described similar incidents of entitlement and verbal mistreatment. Commentators debated how wealth and power could insulate individuals from consequences, while activists demanded accountability, arguing that public figures should not be permitted to hide behind influence when their actions inflicted harm on others. Margaret read very little of these discussions, yet she sensed the cultural shift quietly forming, a shift that placed dignity above status and demanded fairness even from those shielded by privilege. The restaurant owner scheduled several meetings with representatives from hospitality organizations who wished to use Margaret's story as an educational catalyst, helping train workers and managers to recognize, confront, and prevent abusive customer behavior in upscale environments. Margaret attended these meetings with a calm presence, offering insights drawn from decades of experience rather than theoretical instructions, and the leaders listened attentively, acknowledging that her lived perspective provided the clarity their institutions had been lacking. Although she was not accustomed to speaking in such formal settings, her voice carried a quiet strength that made people lean in, recognizing the truth woven into every measured sentence she delivered. As the program took shape, major media outlets began covering the initiative, framing it as a necessary response to systemic issues within customer service industries where emotional labor often went unnoticed, despite being essential to maintaining standards of hospitality. Margaret watched these segments with cautious appreciation, understanding that not every story received an opportunity to spark genuine change, and she felt deeply grateful that hers had unfolded in a way that might protect future workers from the demeaning treatment she had endured. Her family, especially her younger sister, called repeatedly to express pride, reminding her that courage often appeared not in loud declarations, but in quiet decisions made at unexpected crossroads. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted on the billionaire's corporate board as shareholders questioned how his public behavior might affect international partnerships and ongoing negotiations that required stable reputations to maintain investor confidence. Several advisors reportedly urged him to address the situation through a formal apology, but he remained silent publicly, perhaps believing that time would erase the incident or that his influence could shield him from lasting consequences. However, The internet's memory proved far more persistent than he anticipated, with clips, commentaries, and analysis videos continuing to circulate widely, often highlighting the contrast between his belligerence and Margaret's calm. Margaret's life, though impacted by sudden visibility, remained grounded in the routines that had always defined her, and she continued taking the subway home each evening, carrying the weight of her day's work with a newfound sense of purpose rather than exhaustion. The restaurant staff treated her with increased warmth, not because she had become an online figure, but because her strength had reminded them of their collective resilience, something often overlooked amid the pressures of high-end service. Younger servers sought her guidance, asking how she had remained composed during the confrontation, and she told them gently that dignity grew through years of choosing patience over pride, even when patience felt undeserved. The philanthropic organization that had contacted her earlier finalized plans for her first speaking engagement, inviting her to share her experience at a panel discussion focused on protecting service workers' rights in luxury establishments. Although the idea of speaking on a stage made her nervous, she agreed quietly, understanding that silence had allowed too many injustices to thrive unnoticed. She spent evenings preparing thoughtful notes on how respect should form the foundation of every service interaction, regardless of wealth or status, and she crafted each sentence with the same careful attention she once applied to polishing silverware before dinner service. As the date of the panel approached, the story continued shifting from viral spectacle to meaningful dialogue, expanding into classrooms, training workshops, and online forums dedicated to workplace ethics. What had begun as a humiliating moment in a crowded dining room had evolved into a cultural touchstone that illuminated the importance of valuing the humanity of those whose labor often went unseen. Margaret carried this transformation gently, recognizing that her role was not to become a symbol, but to remain a steady voice, reminding others that every person, regardless of uniform or paycheck, deserved to be treated with unshakable dignity. In the days leading up to the panel discussion, Margaret noticed a subtle but comforting shift in the way people spoke to her, as though the public's growing admiration had quietly woven a protective layer around her that softened the edges of the attention she received. She moved through the restaurant with calm assurance, performing each task with the same measured steadiness she had carried for decades, yet now her coworkers watched her with a kind of pride that made the familiar space feel gentler and more dignified. Even the manager, who often appeared nervous when discussing sensitive topics, began consulting her more frequently about staff morale and customer relations, acknowledging that her perspective carried weight he had not recognized before. One afternoon, as she prepared for the evening service, the restaurant owner approached with a message that a distinguished guest wished to meet her privately, someone whose influence extended far beyond the city's culinary circles. Margaret hesitated, unsure what such a meeting might entail, but she agreed with quiet resolve, recognizing that unexpected opportunities often required stepping into unfamiliar rooms with courage rather than caution. The owner led her to a secluded table near the window, where an elegantly dressed woman in her 70s sat with a warm but perceptive smile, exuding the kind of authority that came from decades of advocacy rather than wealth or intimidation. The woman introduced herself as the philanthropist who had contacted the restaurant earlier, explaining that she had spent much of her life funding programs designed to protect overlooked workers, particularly those in industries where power imbalances were most common. She spoke with a gentle cadence, choosing her words thoughtfully, and told Margaret that the viral moment had reminded her why she began her work in the first place, reigniting a passion she feared had dulled with age. Margaret listened respectfully, surprised by how comfortable she felt in the woman's presence, as though they shared a mutual understanding shaped by different journeys but identical values. The philanthropist leaned forward and explained that she wanted to sponsor a new initiative centered around Margaret's message, focusing on training both workers and employers in fostering environments where dignity, empathy, and fairness were non-negotiable principles. She envisioned creating workshops, resource hubs, and community networks that could support individuals in standing up for themselves, while also offering guidance to businesses seeking genuine cultural change. Margaret felt a quiet swell of emotion rise within her, realizing that her difficult moment in the dining room had become a catalyst for something far more meaningful than public attention or fleeting online praise. As they continued talking, the philanthropist shared stories from her own youth, recalling times when she had been dismissed, talked over, or belittled simply because people assumed age or gender equated to weakness. Her memories mirrored Margaret's experiences in surprising ways, weaving a bridge of empathy between two women who had weathered different storms but carried the same unbroken core of resilience. The conversation flowed with an ease that made Margaret forget her nervousness, allowing her to speak candidly about the challenges she had faced throughout her life, both inside and outside the restaurant. When the philanthropist finally paused, she looked at Margaret with an expression of earnest respect and told her that the world needed more voices like hers, voices that didn't rely on volume, status, or aggression to make an impact, but instead spoke truth with clarity and compassion. She expressed her belief that Margaret's story could help reframe public understanding of service work, shifting it away from outdated notions of servitude and toward a recognition of the essential humanity that binds all people, regardless of financial or social standing. Hearing those words felt like a gentle unlocking in Margaret's chest, releasing years of quiet hurt and reminding her that her worth had never been tied to a uniform or a paycheck. They continued discussing the structure of the new program, and Margaret found herself offering suggestions she hadn't realized she possessed, drawing from decades of first-hand knowledge to shape ideas that blended practicality with empathy. The philanthropist listened attentively, occasionally jotting notes on a small leather-bound pad, clearly valuing every insight Margaret shared. It was the first time in her life that someone with influence sought her expertise, not out of obligation or charity, but because her understanding held genuine, indispensable value. Before leaving, the philanthropist extended an invitation for Margaret to join the board overseeing the initiative, assuring her that the role would be tailored to her comfort level and supported by experienced staff who could handle logistical tasks. Margaret felt stunned by the offer, recognizing how significant such a position could be, yet she accepted with gentle gratitude, understanding that this path aligned with the quiet conviction she had carried her entire life that dignity, once defended, must also be shared. As the philanthropist departed, the restaurant's golden evening light reflected softly across the table where they had spoken, creating a warm glow that seemed to settle around Margaret like a blessing. She took a slow breath, absorbing the weight and beauty of the moment, feeling a transformation take shape inside her, with a steadiness that felt both new and deeply familiar. Walking back through the dining room, she sensed that her steps carried a different rhythm now, no longer merely those of a server moving through routine, but of a woman discovering her own voice in a world that had finally begun listening. Margaret walked to work the following week with a quiet confidence that surprised her, realizing that the anxiety she once carried like a heavy coat had slowly begun slipping from her shoulders as new opportunities shaped the rhythm of her days. Her mornings no longer felt like a test of endurance, but instead unfolded with a sense of purpose, as though each step toward the restaurant brought her closer to a future she had never dared to imagine. Although her uniform remained the same, something within her had shifted decisively, granting her a posture that blended humility with an undeniable sense of belonging. As word spread about her upcoming position on the initiative's advisory board, the restaurant's staff began treating her not only with respect, but with a gentle admiration that reflected the pride they felt in witnessing someone from their own ranks rise into a role of greater influence. Younger servers frequently sought her guidance on handling difficult guests, and she listened with patience, offering advice that balanced professional composure with self-respect, reminding them that boundaries were an essential form of dignity rather than an act of defiance. Each conversation filled her with a profound gratitude, showing her that mentorship, rather than authority, was the true core of leadership. The restaurant owner soon invited her to join a strategic planning meeting that included several hospitality consultants, explaining that her experience and perspective were crucial to shaping policies that would genuinely protect employees rather than simply appease public opinion. Margaret sat at the conference table with a mixture of calm and disbelief, noticing how the others leaned forward attentively whenever she spoke, acknowledging the value of her ideas with nods that felt both validating and deeply unexpected. She found herself suggesting improvements to training processes, customer conduct guidelines, and even architectural changes to ensure safer workspaces, learning that her insights carried practical weight others had overlooked for years. Outside the restaurant, her story continued inspiring communities across the city, with several organizations requesting her presence at workshops aimed at promoting respectful interactions between workers and clients in high-pressure environments. Margaret attended these events cautiously at first, worried that public speaking might unravel her composure, yet each appearance flowed more naturally than she expected, as though her voice had finally found the rhythm it had always been meant to carry. People thanked her for being a reminder that courage didn't require wealth or fame, only the willingness to honor one's own worth in moments when silence felt easier but far less honest. Her newfound visibility soon led to an invitation from a prestigious hospitality college that wished to feature her in a seminar on ethics and interpersonal communication, hoping to show students how dignity could transform professional dynamics even in the most challenging situations. Margaret hesitated, unsure whether she deserved such recognition, but she agreed gently, understanding that her presence might influence young workers who looked for real-world examples rather than theoretical lectures. Standing at the lectern before a room full of students, she spoke with a steady voice about the importance of respect, both given and received, and how protective silence often disguised wounds that deserved acknowledgement rather than dismissal. As applause filled the hall, she realized that she no longer feared large audiences because she was not performing or pretending, but simply sharing truth drawn from a lifetime of lived reality, making the moment feel less like a spotlight and more like an honest conversation among equals. The dean privately thanked her afterward, expressing interest in establishing a scholarship program in her name for students pursuing careers in hospitality management with an emphasis on equitable labor practices. Margaret felt overwhelmed yet deeply honored, recognizing that such a legacy could outlast her own career and elevate countless workers who continued to navigate the delicate terrain of customer service. Meanwhile, the philanthropic initiative progressed rapidly, with her voice shaping key structural decisions and educational materials that would be distributed nationally to restaurants seeking to adopt more respectful workplace cultures. For the first time, Margaret saw her experience translated into tangible programs capable of protecting others, and the realization stirred a sense of fulfillment that reached deeper than any promotion or financial reward. She understood now that resilience was not merely the ability to withstand hardship, but the strength to transform pain into purpose, allowing personal adversity to serve as a foundation for collective progress. Her personal life brightened as well, though in quieter ways, as neighbors and acquaintances approached her with warm words, saying they felt proud to share a community with her and inspired by her unwavering calm. Even mundane errands like visiting the grocery store carried a new sense of connection, with strangers offering smiles or brief conversations that affirmed she had touched people far beyond the circle of her profession. These interactions filled her days with a softness she had not felt in years, reminding her gently that recognition, when grounded in authenticity, could heal parts of the spirit long neglected. One evening, as she walked home beneath the glow of streetlights, Margaret paused at a crosswalk and reflected on the unexpected journey that had unfolded since the confrontation with the billionaire. She realized that her identity had expanded far beyond her role as a waitress, not because she had abandoned it, but because she had allowed herself to be seen in ways she once believed impossible. The world had changed around her, and she had changed with it, stepping into a version of herself shaped not by hardship, but by the quiet strength that had always lived within her. She returned to her apartment with a serene smile, feeling the rare warmth of a life that was not only improving but blossoming, sustained by community, respect, and the enduring truth that dignity once defended had a way of illuminating every path that followed. As the weeks unfolded, Margaret observed a profound shift in the public conversation, noticing how her story had evolved from a viral incident into a broader cultural dialogue that demanded accountability from those who had long acted without fear of consequences. News programs invited experts to discuss the deeper implications of entitlement within luxury spaces, and social commentators dissected the imbalance of power that allowed wealthy individuals to mistreat workers while escaping meaningful repercussions. Margaret remained humble amid the growing discourse, yet she felt an unmistakable current of change sweeping through the city, as though the truth she had spoken had shaken an old foundation that desperately needed to crack. Meanwhile, the billionaire's silence grew increasingly conspicuous, drawing criticism from journalists who questioned why a man with such immense influence refused to address an incident that had clearly touched a national nerve. His corporate board began feeling the strain of public scrutiny, especially as international partners expressed discomfort over aligning their brands with someone whose actions had become synonymous with disrespect and cultural insensitivity. Reports soon surfaced that internal discussions were underway regarding whether his continued leadership posed a reputational threat to major investments, signaling that his power, once taken for granted, had begun eroding beneath the weight of collective disapproval. Margaret heard these developments secondhand, mostly from coworkers who eagerly shared news articles during breaks, though she never allowed herself to feel triumphant or vindictive, believing that justice should emerge from fairness rather than spite. Still, she sensed a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the world was finally holding someone accountable for the harm he caused, not because he had insulted her specifically, but because his actions represented a pattern that had gone unchecked for far too long. The realization brought her a gentle clarity that justice often worked like tidewater, slow, persistent, and most powerful when people united their voices. The tipping point arrived when a high-profile philanthropic summit invited Margaret to speak about dignity within service professions, placing her alongside activists, scholars, and industry leaders who had spent decades advocating for labor rights. The invitation alone signified the depth of her impact, but the weight of the moment truly struck her when she stepped into the grand auditorium filled with hundreds of attendees representing an array of influential institutions. She felt a tremor of nerves at first, yet the warmth of the audience's applause washed over her like a calming tide, reminding her that she was not standing on that stage alone, but supported by thousands who believed in her quiet strength. As she began speaking, her voice carried through the room with a steady resonance, describing how dignity was often undermined, not by explicit cruelty alone, but by small acts of disregard that accumulated over time, shaping environments where workers felt unseen and undervalued. She articulated the emotional labor required to maintain composure in the face of disrespect, explaining how every server, janitor, nurse, or clerk deserved the same basic recognition afforded to those who held wealth or authority. Her words drew thoughtful silence from the audience, followed by waves of applause that swelled with each point she made, affirming the importance of the perspective she offered. After the summit, several leaders approached her with proposals for collaborative initiatives, including a national hospitality training standard based on empathy-centered interactions and a research project examining workplace power dynamics in the service industry. One foundation even offered to fund a citywide awareness campaign featuring her voice and likeness, though she politely declined the latter, preferring to keep the focus on the message rather than her personal identity. However, she agreed to lend her insight to the policy discussions, recognizing how far-reaching the impact could be if institutions adopted practices rooted in genuine respect. Meanwhile, the billionaire's situation worsened when leaked documents revealed internal dissent among his board members, including concerns that his conduct had jeopardized several pending international agreements. Public pressure intensified as investors questioned whether he remained fit to represent a global enterprise, leading to a formal review of his leadership. Observers noted that this marked one of the rare occasions in which the consequences of mistreating a service worker extended beyond temporary embarrassment and into the realm of real, structural accountability. Margaret followed the developments with measured detachment, understanding that the outcome, whatever it might be, belonged more to the broader movement than to her personally. She reminded herself that justice was not about punishing individuals, but about reshaping systems to prevent future harm, and she found comfort in seeing the world finally confront a truth workers had known for generations. The knowledge that her moment of courage had sparked meaningful institutional introspection filled her with a profound sense of purpose that reinforced her commitment to the initiative she now helped guide. One evening, while reviewing materials for an upcoming workshop, she received a call from the philanthropist who had become both mentor and friend, informing her that the billionaire had officially stepped down following a unanimous board decision. The news settled over Margaret like a quiet exhale, carrying neither celebration nor bitterness, but a calm recognition that the world had turned a necessary page. She thanked the philanthropist softly, acknowledging that accountability had arrived not through vengeance, but through collective insistence, that dignity mattered more than influence. As she hung up the phone, Margaret looked around her small apartment, noticing how unchanged it appeared despite the remarkable transformation of her life. And she smiled gently, understanding that true progress rarely announced itself with spectacle. Instead, it unfolded through steady choices, difficult truths, and the unwavering courage to speak when silence seemed easier. She returned to her notes with renewed focus, ready to continue shaping a future where respect flowed not from status but from shared humanity, trusting that the next chapter would carry her message even further into the world. In the months that followed the billionaire's resignation, the ripple effects of Margaret's story continued expanding with remarkable steadiness, reaching industries far beyond hospitality and inspiring conversations in corporate offices, union halls, and community centers where workers shared their own experiences of quiet endurance. The viral moment no longer stood alone as a singular incident, but had grown into a recognizable symbol of how everyday people could confront injustice with dignity and reshape the expectations placed upon them by a society often too willing to overlook their humanity. Margaret watched this transformation from a position of humble observation, recognizing that the momentum building around her message had become larger than anything she had ever envisioned. National labor organizations began referencing her story in campaigns advocating for stronger worker protections, citing her calm resistance as evidence that employees often faced disrespectful treatment that remained invisible unless captured publicly. Editorials in major newspapers praised the way her confrontation demonstrated that true authority originated not from wealth but from character, and several senators mentioned her name during committee discussions on workplace dignity. Margaret found it surreal to hear her story echoed across such influential platforms, yet she remained grounded, always reminding herself that her own journey began with a simple decision to speak truthfully in the face of arrogance. Her advisory role on the philanthropic initiative deepened further as new partnerships formed with universities and policy institutes seeking comprehensive research on the emotional and psychological toll endured by service workers. Margaret participated in roundtable discussions where scholars, policymakers, and labor leaders valued her insights with a sincerity that continually humbled her, recognizing that her real-world experience filled gaps that academic studies could not easily capture. These sessions often revealed patterns of systemic neglect that had persisted for decades, strengthening their resolve to develop interventions capable of reshaping workplace norms across multiple sectors. Meanwhile, the restaurant where Margaret had spent so many years gradually transformed into a model of respectful and ethical hospitality under the new policies she helped design. Staff members noticed a significant improvement in morale as customers began treating them with a heightened sense of mindfulness, likely influenced by the broader cultural conversation her story had ignited. The environment became more collaborative and less hierarchical, with communication flowing more openly, and workers feeling empowered to speak up when confronted with unreasonable demands. Margaret took quiet pride in witnessing these shifts, understanding that real change often began with subtle adjustments that eventually accumulated into lasting cultural renewal. The speaking invitations continued steadily, though she accepted only those aligned with her values, choosing intimate workshops and educational programs rather than glamorous events that seemed more interested in spectacle than substance. She felt most at home in smaller rooms filled with workers, eager to learn how to navigate difficult interactions while preserving their self-respect, and she dedicated herself to offering guidance rooted in empathy rather than platitudes. Her words often resonated deeply with attendees, many of whom approached her afterward with tears in their eyes, expressing how liberating it felt to know they were not alone in their struggles. Her personal growth mirrored the shifting landscape around her, as she gradually shed the lingering insecurities that had shadowed her for years, replacing them with a quiet, resilient confidence that made her feel more fully herself than she had in decades. She found joy in simple routines, like arranging fresh flowers in her apartment or enjoying a late-night cup of tea while reading letters from individuals touched by her story. These moments reminded her that even the most profound societal changes began with small acts of kindness, patience, and respect, qualities she had cultivated long before the world took notice. One day, she received an unexpected offer from a well-regarded nonprofit dedicated to worker advocacy, inviting her to serve as a community advisor on a new citywide campaign promoting safer and more equitable labor conditions. Margaret hesitated initially, unsure whether she possessed the necessary expertise, but the organization assured her that her lived experience provided a perspective more valuable than any formal credential. After thoughtful consideration, she accepted the role, recognizing that the position aligned perfectly with the purpose she had grown into since the incident at the restaurant. As she settled into her expanded responsibilities, Margaret felt herself stepping into a phase of life defined not by survival but by contribution, shaping dialogues that had the potential to influence countless workers across the country. She found comfort in knowing that her efforts extended beyond herself, offering hope and guidance to people who faced the same quiet battles she had weathered throughout her career. Each new engagement deepened her understanding of the profound interconnectedness between dignity, community, and justice, reinforcing her belief that every person held an essential place within the larger fabric of society. One evening, as she walked home beneath the soft glow of street lamps illuminating the sidewalk, she reflected on the extraordinary path she had traveled, a path shaped not by ambition or design, but by a single moment when she chose to defend her worth with unwavering calm. She realized that her life had expanded into something richer and more meaningful than she ever imagined possible, guided by the simple truth that respect, once affirmed, radiated outward like light through a window, touching lives far beyond its original spark. With a serene smile, she whispered a quiet promise to continue carrying that light forward, trusting that her journey still held many chapters waiting to be written. As the seasons shifted gently from late autumn into early winter, Margaret found that the world around her seemed to move with a renewed sense of attentiveness, as though the lessons born from her quiet act of defiance continued echoing far beyond the restaurant that had once been the center of her life. The initiative she helped guide gained widespread traction, inspiring similar programs in neighboring cities and sparking collaborations between labor advocates, ethical business leaders, and community organizers determined to reshape workplace culture across multiple industries. Margaret watched these developments with a humble awe, recognizing that genuine change rarely unfolded all at once, but instead grew steadily through the collective courage of individuals willing to confront long-standing norms. She noticed that even everyday interactions seemed subtly altered by the evolving cultural climate, with customers offering kinder words to staff and employers showing greater curiosity about the emotional well-being of their teams. Articles analyzing the Margaret effect appeared in business journals, exploring how dignity-centered leadership could improve both morale and performance, and several universities incorporated her story into coursework on management ethics. Margaret felt almost startled by the magnitude of these discussions, yet she embraced them with a quiet grace, understanding that the impact reached far beyond her and belonged to everyone who had ever felt unseen in their workplace. During this time, she also began tending to parts of herself she had long neglected, realizing that healing was not only about repairing past wounds, but also about allowing new possibilities to take root with intention rather than fear. She spent more evenings reading on her small couch, sipping chamomile tea while the soft hum of traffic drifted through her window, finding comfort in the gentle routine of solitude that felt restorative rather than isolating. Sometimes she took long walks along the river, watching the reflections of city lights shimmer across the water, and felt a growing peace settle in her chest as she finally released the belief that she needed to remain invisible to avoid conflict. The nonprofit organization she had joined soon offered her an expanded advisory position, inviting her to help design a statewide curriculum that would be implemented in training centers for service workers across multiple sectors. Margaret felt both honored and slightly overwhelmed, yet she accepted the challenge with her characteristic steadiness, knowing that her lived experience held the power to shape a more humane path for the next generation of workers. She devoted herself to the project with thoughtful dedication, carefully crafting modules that emphasized empathy, self-respect, and resilience, believing that true protection came not only from policy, but from helping individuals value their own worth. Meanwhile, media outlets revisited her story as part of year-end reflections on cultural turning points, framing her confrontation with the billionaire as one of the most significant symbolic moments in the national conversation about power and civility. Commentators noted how her calm response had inspired a broader sense of accountability, leading to policy reforms in several major corporations and prompting discussions about mandatory ethical conduct training for executives. Margaret listened to these reflections with a gentle detachment, feeling grateful that the narrative had shifted from conflict to progress, and that her role had become a reminder of humanity rather than scandal. Despite the growing recognition, she stayed deeply committed to her everyday responsibilities, continuing to mentor younger servers at the restaurant and offering warm encouragement whenever she noticed signs of doubt or fatigue in their expressions. Her presence became a steady anchor within the team, embodying a sense of patience and wisdom that helped others navigate the pressures of a demanding environment with greater confidence. She found particular joy in guiding new employees who entered the industry with apprehension, assuring them that their dignity remained unshakable, no matter how challenging a shift might become. Her relationship with the philanthropist blossomed into a genuine friendship, marked by long conversations about justice, compassion, and the small acts of bravery that stitched together the broader fabric of societal change. The two women met regularly for tea in a quiet cafe tucked beneath a row of brownstones, where they exchanged stories about their pasts and shared hopes for a future grounded in empathy rather than hierarchy. Margaret cherished these moments deeply, recognizing that the bond they had formed represented not only personal connection, but also the power of aligned purpose. As winter approached more fully, she received an invitation to keynote a national conference dedicated to improving workplace culture across service industries, a role that would position her at the forefront of a movement she had unintentionally sparked. She initially hesitated, unsure whether she could stand before such a large audience, but after thoughtful consideration, she accepted with quiet determination, recognizing that her voice carried weight not because she sought attention but because people trusted the sincerity behind it. Preparing her speech became an act of gentle reflection, allowing her to honor the journey that had led her from an ordinary evening shift to a place of transformative influence. On the night before her keynote address, Margaret sat by her window, watching snowflakes drift softly through the streetlights, feeling a calm sense of readiness settle over her. She realized that she no longer feared being seen, because visibility no longer felt like vulnerability, but rather an opportunity to extend the truth she had once spoken in a moment of hurt. Her life had expanded beyond the boundaries she once accepted, growing into a tapestry woven with resilience, purpose, community, and the profound understanding that dignity, when protected fiercely and expressed gently, possessed the power to reshape not only individuals, but entire systems. With a steady breath and a thoughtful smile, she whispered a quiet affirmation to herself, acknowledging how far she had come and how much awaited her just beyond the horizon. The morning of the national conference arrived, with a quiet stillness that made the city feel contemplative, as though the world itself understood the weight of what Margaret was about to step into. She stood backstage with her notes held gently in her hands, breathing in the low hum of the auditorium as hundreds of attendees filtered into their seats, their conversations weaving soft threads of anticipation through the air. When the stage manager signaled that she had 5 minutes before her introduction, Margaret felt a calm certainty settle over her, a sense that every hardship she had endured had prepared her for this singular moment of truth. As she walked toward the podium, the audience rose to their feet in a wave of warm applause that swept across the room like a tide, enveloping her with a gratitude she still struggled to believe she deserved. Her speech unfolded with a steady rhythm, each sentence shaped by sincerity rather than performance, painting a vivid portrait of the emotional labor workers carried and the quiet strength that had sustained her throughout her long career. She spoke about dignity not as a lofty ideal, but as a simple necessity, something fragile yet powerful, easily damaged yet profoundly restorative when honored with genuine respect. Halfway through her speech, however, she noticed a slight commotion near the side entrance of the auditorium as a man in a tailored suit slipped inside with a hesitant posture that contrasted sharply with the confident stride she remembered all too well. She recognized him instantly, the billionaire whose insult had ignited the chain of events that brought her to this stage, and for a moment, her breath caught as the memory of that humiliating evening flickered through her mind. Yet the fear she once associated with his presence no longer held power, replaced instead by a quiet strength forged through months of growth, healing, and collective support. He lingered near the wall, unsure whether he should remain or retreat, but the staff guided him toward an empty seat as her speech continued with careful grace. When she finished, the audience erupted into applause once more, but Margaret felt her attention drawn toward the man whose gaze remained fixed on her, with an expression she had never seen on him before, one steeped not in arrogance, but in something far closer to regret. As she stepped down from the stage, he approached with slow, deliberate steps, pausing several feet away, as though unwilling to intrude upon her space without permission. For a long moment, neither spoke, the silence between them heavy with unspoken history, yet softened by the transformation both had undergone in their own ways. Finally, he cleared his throat and apologized in a voice stripped of pride, admitting that the public consequences he faced had forced him to confront aspects of himself he had long ignored. He confessed that losing his position had shaken him deeply, compelling him to reassess the way he treated others, and to acknowledge the harm he had caused not just to Margaret, but to countless workers whose names he never bothered to learn. Margaret listened without interrupting, observing how genuinely he seemed to struggle with his own remorse. And although she held no desire for revenge, she also refused to offer absolution lightly. She told him gently that healing required more than an apology it demanded: commitment, accountability, and a willingness to change the patterns that had caused harm in the first place. Her voice remained steady and compassionate, reflecting not forgiveness alone but a deeper understanding that redemption belonged to those who earned it through consistent action rather than a single moment of contrition. The billionaire nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words, and explained that he had begun participating in several initiatives focused on ethical leadership, hoping to rebuild his character from the ground up rather than hide behind wealth or influence. He mentioned that hearing her speech had reminded him of the humanity he had neglected in pursuit of power, and he thanked her quietly for the clarity her courage had offered him, even if the lesson had been painful. Margaret felt a gentle mixture of sadness and empathy as she realized that even those who seemed invincible could carry wounds shaped by misguided ambition and the illusions of superiority. Before leaving, he asked whether she believed people like him could truly change, or whether society would forever see him as the man he once was. Margaret answered with a calm conviction that surprised even her, explaining that change remained possible for anyone willing to accept humility, responsibility, and the slow, often uncomfortable process of rebuilding trust. She reminded him that dignity extended not only to those who suffered but also to those who sought redemption, provided they approached it with sincerity and sustained effort. As he walked away, Margaret felt no lingering anger or resentment, only a quiet closure that settled over her like a soft blanket, signaling that a chapter long shadowed by pain had finally reached its natural end. She returned to the conference hall where attendees greeted her with warm smiles and heartfelt admiration, unaware of the private reconciliation that had just unfolded. Standing amid the crowd, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace, recognizing that the journey she had taken from humiliation to empowerment, from silence to influence, had brought her to a place of profound emotional freedom. Later that evening, as she stepped outside into the cool winter air, Margaret looked up at the distant glow of the city skyline and whispered a small, grateful breath into the night. She understood now that justice was not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it arrived quietly, in the form of transformation, accountability, and the courage to face past wounds with compassion rather than bitterness. She walked toward the streetlight with steady steps, trusting that the final chapter of her story would unfold not with anger but with the graceful strength she had carried all along. In the quiet days following the conference, Margaret found herself moving through the world with a softness that felt almost unfamiliar, as though the burden she once carried had dissolved into something gentler and far more manageable. She returned to her routines with renewed clarity, noticing how each ordinary moment brewing morning coffee, folding her apron, greeting coworkers held a quiet beauty that she had often overlooked when life moved too quickly for reflection. The city around her seemed calmer as well, or perhaps she had simply learned to navigate it with a steadier heart, guided by the understanding that dignity, once reclaimed, reshaped everything it touched. Her story continued inspiring countless others, not through dramatic headlines or viral clips, but through the quieter, more enduring impact of workshops, conversations, and policy changes that grew from the seed she planted unintentionally on that unforgettable night. She watched younger workers step into their jobs with a sense of confidence she wished she had possessed at their age, encouraged by a cultural shift that placed greater value on fairness and mutual respect. Seeing them thrive filled her with a peaceful satisfaction, knowing that her journey had helped carve a path they could walk with lighter steps. One evening, while closing her planner after a long day of meetings, she paused to reflect on how extraordinary her life had become, not because of fame or attention, but because she had finally allowed herself to stand fully in her truth. She realized that the humiliation she once feared had transformed into a profound turning point, guiding her toward a purpose that stretched far beyond the walls of the restaurant where everything began. The arc of her story, once defined by exhaustion and quiet endurance, had grown into a testament to resilience, integrity, and the power of one voice to illuminate a much larger injustice. Her relationships deepened as well, especially with the philanthropist who had become a cherished companion on this unexpected journey, offering wisdom, encouragement, and a sense of shared mission that brought meaning to their collaboration. Together, they continued shaping programs designed to uplift and empower workers, recognizing that structural change required collective effort and unwavering commitment. Margaret found comfort in knowing that she was no longer facing the world alone, but supported by a network of individuals who believed fiercely in the cause she had come to represent. As winter slowly melted into early spring, Margaret walked through her neighborhood with a gentle smile, feeling the crisp air soften around her as blooming trees lined the familiar streets. She understood, with quiet certainty, that the world would always carry moments of cruelty, arrogance, and imbalance. Yet she also knew that kindness and courage possessed the power to counter them in ways that echoed far beyond their immediate impact. Her journey had taught her that standing up for oneself did not require force or anger, but rather a steadfast belief in one's own worth, expressed with clarity and grace even when circumstances felt overwhelming. One night, as she prepared for bed, she stood by her small window and gazed at the city lights shimmering across the horizon, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over her. She whispered softly to herself, "Respect isn't something you demand, it's something you embody until the world learns how to mirror it back." The words carried a gentle wisdom, born from both pain and triumph, and she knew they would stay with her for the rest of her life. With that final thought, Margaret turned off the light and allowed herself to rest deeply, knowing that her voice had traveled farther than she ever imagined and that her legacy rooted in empathy, dignity, and quiet strength would continue shaping lives long after her own story reached its gentle close. And to those who would one day hear her journey, she would offer a simple invitation. Tell me, what would you have done? And how will you choose dignity when it matters most?